Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sake Revolution. This is America's first sake podcast. I'm your host, John Puma from the Sake Notes. I'm also that guy over at the Internet Sake Discord, as well as the Reddit r/sake community. But for purposes of this show, I'm a local sake nerd.
And I am your host, Timothy Sullivan. I'm a sake samurai, a sake educator, and I'm also the founder of the Urban Sake website. And every week, John and I will be tasting and chatting about all things sake and doing our very best to make it fun and easy to understand.
Outstanding, Tim. Now,
yes,
my understanding is that we do a lot of series on this show.
Yes.
And I think we've got a few running still, but I feel like we need to add another.
It's like Lay's potato chips. You can never have just one. We need another series.
Yes, exactly. You cannot just one. Do they still use that as a slogan? Yeah,
I don't know.
I honestly have no idea. But that's not important. The Lay's potato chips slogan is not the important thing today. The important thing is that we're going to be starting a short series that we're actually going to do sequentially, mostly sequentially.
Yes.
About Shubo. Now, Tim, do you want to tell everybody at home what exactly is Shubo?
Well, there's two words for what we call Shubo. You can call it Shubo or you can call it Moto. And both of these things mean the same thing. We talked about Shubo and Moto early on in our podcast careers when we were doing a run through the sake production process.
That's right.
So Shubo is one of the steps of the sake production process. And the best way I've found to translate this is called the fermentation starter. So it's the point in the production process where all the ingredients come together in one tank for the first time and fermentation actually starts.
So this is where the action begins.
Yes, where the bubbling begins.
Yeah, where the bubbling begins. Yes. Great. Okay, so that's a nice little overview on what Shubo is. And in today's episode, I believe we're covering the most common type of Shubo. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, we're going to look over 4 episodes. We're going to take a look at the different styles of Shubo, of fermentation starter. And we're going to start with the most modern, the most used, and the most common method of getting sake up and running.
All right. And what do they call that, Tim?
Well, they call that Sokujo.
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 Doesn't exactly have a ring to it, I have to say.
It's the modern, fast, and most common fermentation starter method. Yep.
We like fast and we like modern, so I can see why a lot of breweries would adapt that.
Yeah. So the word Shubo is actually really interesting in and of itself. If we break it down and translate it, Shu means sake, right, and Bo is a way to say mother. So it is the mother of sake, Shubo. So that is a really interesting way if you break down the way the words are put together. The sake mother, you can think of it as the seed mash, the fermentation starter, the yeast starter. It's got a lot of different names, but it's really where the rubber hits the road for fermentation.
Great. So then Sokujo, modern, everybody's doing it these days.
Yes. All the cool kids are doing it.
All the cool kids are doing it. What does it entail? What is getting into the weeds a little bit, what is Sokujo?
Well, there's one primary difference between Sokujo and the 3 other fermentation starter methods we're going to look at. And it all has to do with prepping the tank for the addition of yeast. So for Sokujo, what they do is they take commercially available lactic acid, and it's in a liquid form, and they dump that into the tank on the first day of starting the Shubo. And this lactic acid has a very specific purpose. The lactic acid kills any unwanted wild yeast, any unwanted bacteria, and it creates a little bit of a higher acid environment in the tank. And sake yeast really thrives in that environment. So it kills off the unwanted things, creates the ideal environment for sake yeast. And when you put the sake yeast in, it can just flourish uninhibited and grow really strong. So this addition of lactic acid manually, you just dump it in. That's the one thing that differentiates modern Sokujo Shubo from other fermentation starters.
So it's like literally like setting the stage then for the rest of the production. That's interesting.
Yeah. And just a quick preview, all the other methods involve lactic acid evolving naturally over time. But with Sokujo, we take a shortcut. That's why it's called the modern quick method.
And I think the spoiler alert is that those other methods are quite old.
Yeah. So Shubo, I want to tell you a really quick story about Shubo, because when I did my internship at the sake brewery in Niigata at Hakai-san, I spent 1 month of my time there working in the Shubo room. So this is the room where they do the yeast starter, and there's one person who's the manager of the Shubo room, and he taught me all the steps of making Shubo, and I got to do this several times and got some good experience on it. And I remember we were standing there stirring the Shubo one day, and I looked over to him and I said, can you tell me, when does fermentation actually begin? Like, we put the yeast in 4 hours ago. Are these bubbles fermentation? Like, is it happening now? And he looked at me and he said, that's the mystery of Shubo. We never know when that moment of birth for sake is. And I was like, wow, that's really cool and kind of profound. It's a natural process. We don't have exacting control over it. We're just shepherding the microbes to do a certain thing. And that lesson always stayed with me. We are not in the driver's seat when it comes to fermentation. We can put the microbes in a certain condition, but we really rely on them to make the magic happen.
And we don't know exactly
the
moment.
No, you don't know exactly which bubble on the surface is the first bubble of fermentation. You never know. I just thought that was so cool. It's like really, really interesting, and taught me that you have to go with the flow. And someone told me once, fermentation is wrangling microbes, and that is really true.
Interesting. So that's all they're doing. They're just popping in some lactic acid that commercially available.
Yes. And for years before I worked at a sake brewery, I learned from a textbook, they take lactic acid and they dump it in. And I said, okay, I understand in theory, but I never really knew how it works. And when I worked at the sake brewery, they had a giant cardboard box with a spout on the front. And they would bring a test tube over, and those giant containers of laundry detergent with a spout in the front? And you're like, yeah, it was just like that. And they would open up the spout like a box wine, and the liquid lactic acid would come out into the test tube. Then they would bring it over to the Shubo tank, and they would dump it in. And I'm like, oh, okay. That's what lactic acid looks like. It kind of looked like glycerin. It was like a viscous, clear liquid. Kind of interesting.
Yeah, I have to say, I don't think I've ever encountered lactic acid in the wild in my day-to-day life. But I've never spent a year at a sake brewery, so I imagine it comes up more often there.
Yeah. So I've heard the addition of lactic acid to Shubo. I've heard that also described as like an eraser going over the mash, where you're erasing all the things you don't want, all the microbes you don't want get taken out, and you get a clean slate ready for the sake yeast to go in. So that's another way to look at it.
And there's no danger of the lactic acid impacting the sake yeast in any way?
That's a great question. I've learned that sake yeast thrives in a higher acid environment. So it primes the pump and lines up the tank specifically for the environment that sake yeast likes.
Excellent. So by its nature as an acid, it's automatically in a good place.
Yep.
For this. That's interesting. That is actually a really, really interesting way to put that. I like that.
Yeah.
Nice.
So let me just paint you a little picture of the Shubo room in a sake brewery.
Oh, all right. Paint me a word picture, Tim.
Yes. Now, Shubo tanks are smaller tanks. They're about waist high if you were to stand next to them. And they are the place where water, rice, koji rice, and yeast come together in a small batch format for the first time. And the interesting thing is that some people think that the purpose of Shubo is to start making alcohol right away and get the sake flowing. But the purpose of Shubo is actually to create a healthy, vibrant yeast colony. So when the brewer orders yeast from the supplier, it arrives in a tiny little vial, and you need to grow that vial up to a vibrant colony that can populate a small tank. And then when we move that tank onto the main fermentation mash, it's strong, vibrant, healthy, ready to go and grow even more. So that's why this Shubo step is sometimes called the yeast starter as well, because it helps bloom the yeast colony, grow the yeast colony. And they do something interesting during Shubo as well. Over the 2-week period where they're making the Shubo, they adjust the temperature daily up and down. So they bring the temperature up and then they bring the temperature down. And that shocks the yeast, and only the healthy, vibrant, strong yeast are going to survive these temperature shocks that they do up and down. So if you look at the temperature chart over the 2 weeks of a Shubo, it goes up and down and up and down, up and down. And this way of kind of manhandling? No, that's not the right word.
Abuse?
We're going to have people protesting outside of sake shops now.
Free the yeast.
Free the yeast. This treatment of the yeast, varying the temperature, really does ensure that the strong, vibrant yeast survive and reproduce. And when you're ready to move the Shubo onto the main fermentation tank, you've got this colony of healthy yeast. And that's really the main focus. But they do that through temperature variation. It's one of the keys for making a healthy Shubo.
All right. I think I get why they would maybe be a little rude to the yeast in order to accomplish that. Survival of the fittest. The best yeast makes it into the tank.
It is quintessential survival of the fittest.
Yeah, quite literally. I remember the first time I went into the Shubo room at a sake brewery, I did not realize that was the Shubo room. And I was very perplexed because these tanks were impossibly small for making. Yeah,
Tiny.
So I was like, there's something wrong. There's no way they're making sake in these tanks. They'd be making like 16 bottles a year. This doesn't make any sense.
John, were you like, I've heard of microbreweries, but this is ridiculous.
I was like, this is something I could do in my living room. This doesn't seem right at all. And then our guide explained to us that, guys, this was very early on in my sake career where I didn't know these things just yet. And I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know exactly what was wrong. And then it was explained to us, no, this is actually just the Shubo room. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. Yeah. And then we went downstairs, and that's where the very, very, very large containers were. And I was like, okay, this makes more sense. I understand.
Yeah. I'm not sure if there was active fermentation going on when you visited, but the Shubo room where I worked was chilly. It was cold. It's refrigerated, actually.
It was chilly, but it wasn't as, I don't know if I would define it as being like really cold, but it was definitely a little chill. The whole brewery was a little bit chilly, to be completely honest.
Yeah. Wasn't Hannah Kirshner telling us about Hawaii and Hokkaido?
Yes. Hawaii, Hokkaido.
The temperature
I believe
extremes.
it was Hawaii was the
Koji room.
Thank you. The words didn't want to come out. The Hawaii was the Koji room, and the Shubo was Hokkaido.
Brr.
Brr.
Cold.
I find it interesting that the Japanese decided to go with Hawaii as their like really warm place. And they've got plenty of warm places in Japan.
I know, they could have called it Okinawa, but they called it
exactly.
Hawaii.
Kept it to like one side of the country and the other side. Hokkaido's in the north, Okinawa in the south, and they've got everything covered.
Yeah. Well, let me give you one more little tidbit of information about Sokujo, which is again our fast modern Shubo method. Why don't you take a guess, John? Of all the sake produced in Japan, what percentage uses the Sokujo method?
I'm going to say something outlandish, like 95.
Oh my God, you're so close. It's 90%. It's 90%.
Originally I was thinking 90, and I was like, you know what? No, I'm going to go deep. I'm going to
Yes.
go for it. I'm going to go for it. But hey, you know what? Within 5%, I'll take it.
Yeah, that was a great guess. So 90% of breweries are using the Sokujo method, the modern fast yeast starter. There's a few advantages to doing Sokujo. One is that it's faster, so you spend less time making your Shubo. And it's cheaper because you don't have to pay people to monitor the Shubo extra amounts of time. And honestly, it's easier to do. It requires less skill for sake brewers because it's a little more easy to pull off than the other methods we're going to talk about in the coming weeks.
Is it also easier to get consistency because it is much more of a controlled situation? You're literally taking something off the shelf and setting the stage using that. It seems like a really good way to get the same result every time you're making a new batch.
Yep, absolutely. With Sokujo, you are jump-starting the process and you're putting lactic acid in manually and you are setting the stage in a very specific way, and you take a lot of the questions out of the process. So that's absolutely right. You can get a lot more consistency. The yeast goes in uninhibited, the exact yeast you selected, and you're off to the races. So it does take a lot of the questions and variables out of the equation.
All right, Tim, and as is customary on our show, we've brought examples of the topic that we're talking about today. So we looked long and hard and found one of the 90% of the sakes out there that uses the Sokujo method. And I want to tell you, it was a lot of work.
We searched high and low to find sakes that fit today's theme of Sokujo.
We did it.
And
found them.
we came up aces.
Who knew? There's so much Sokujo out there.
Let's introduce our sakes.
Yeah, let's introduce our sakes. You go first, sir.
All right. I have a sake that I love. This is Kokuryu Junmai Ginjo. It's from Kokuryu Sake Brewery, and that's located in Fukui Prefecture. This is a sake that is sold again as a Junmai Ginjo. It has an acidity of 1.4, 15% alcohol. The rice milling rate is 55% remaining. We have an SMV of +3, and this sake is 100% Go Hyakuman Goku sake rice.
Aha, the famous Go Hyakuman Goku.
Yes. So, John, that's my sake, the Kokuryu. By the way, that is often translated as Black Dragon.
That's a good name.
Yes, it is a very good name. Very well-loved sake. Can't wait to get this open. But before we do that, John, why don't you tell us about the sake that you brought for our Sokujo episode?
I have the Oze no Yukidoke Okarakuchi Junmai. Okarakuchi. It's very, very respected Karakuchi.
Honorific Karakuchi.
And Karakuchi, as we've talked about on the show before, it means that it's dry. It's
Yes.
very dry.
Yes.
And this is from Ryujin Shuzo in Gunma Prefecture. And we'll get a little more into this as we move on. Tim, do you want do you want to get into the weeds and open up your Kokuryu?
Yes.
All
Let
right.
me get this open. Okay, let's pour this. Okay. So now I've got this in my wine glass. We're going to give this a smell. So this has a really nice restrained aroma. And I've known Kokuryu, or the Black Dragon sake, to have a lot of depth of flavor. But the aroma is still light, balanced, and really kind of enticing. So there's just a hint of something fruity, but primarily it's rice and a nice depth of aroma. It smells so good. Okay, let me give it a taste. So this sake is very clean, smooth, but it's not quiet. It's got a good weight on the palate. There's a little bit of umami flavor on the finish. So yeah, it's that depth of flavor that always gets me with this brand. It's got this weight on the finish that anchors the flavor. And it is light and enticing up front. Just a hint of something fruity, primarily a very smooth rice flavor, and then a hint of umami at the end. Just so good. Something you can really sink your teeth into while still being elegant. That's really what I love about this sake.
Very nice. That sounds great.
It's interesting. So again, our topic for today is Sokujo, which is the fast fermentation starter. And because they use that with this sake, it can help keep flavors cleaner. So Sokujo sakes are, compared to the other fermentation starter methods, we're going to in future talk about Kimoto, Yamahai, and Bodaimoto, but compared to those, Sokujo in general can lend a cleaner flavor.
It sounds like you get a little bit more control over things.
Yep, you take out some of the unknowns.
Right.
And you can get right on to expressing what the yeast wants to do and the type of rice you've introduced there. So you can really have a little bit more overt control over the end product. And it's really expresses itself so beautifully in this sake. I'm fanboying right now, aren't I?
There's nothing wrong with that. Fanboying is
no shame in that.
Fine. I've had my share of fanboy moments on the show. It's completely fine, I think.
So, I am loving this Kokuryu from Fukui. It is highly recommended. Beautiful depth of flavor. And I'm curious to see your reaction to the Okarakuchi from Oze no Yukidoki.
Yeah, so this is... I am a fanboy for this brewery, and this is one of those breweries, not just the brand, but the brewery itself, that anything they make, I'm going to be very excited to taste it.
That is the noisiest bottle opening we've had on the whole series.
Really, this bag is... Ryujin Shuzo usually, actually, I want to say always, uses these UV resistant bags that they put on all their sake, and they help keep the sake from getting UV contamination, but they are also a little loud.
Yeah.
So finally have freed it from the bag. Okay. Now I can actually open it. So the aroma is a little light. There's not a lot going on nose-wise with this sake, but that's not altogether unusual with really dry sake in my experience. You get like a suggestion of freshness, but you don't really get like a huge it's not very perfumey or anything like that. Maybe a little bit of like fresh cut grass and some very, very, very faint fruit, but it's barely there. But the flavor on this sake is a journey. It is an experience when you taste it. It is very dry. I'll go into the stats in just a moment because I didn't do that before I started sipping. I was way too excited. But up front, there is a brightness to this sake. It's big. It's got a nice, inviting amount of action in the front. It is not for the faint of heart. There's a lot going on in this sake.
Well, the one question I have, it sells itself as an okarakuchi, or almost super dry. How are you experiencing how dry or sweet it is?
The dryness is kicking in at the finish, and it is turbo. Like it is very, very dry at the end.
The aftertaste is very dry.
The aftertaste and the finish are very, very dry. And that's what makes, and this is something that we've talked about before, is that you can never go wrong with food with dry sake. Like dry sake and a lot of is going to get a lot more a lot more leeway, I think, with regard to pairing. You can probably do a lot more with a dry sake. But the weird thing about this is I did mention that the front was really kind of big and kind of bright. The body, the mouthfeel is very, very light. And then the finish is very, very dry. And those stats that I neglected to mention earlier. So this is a Junmai. It's using Yamada Nishiki for the Kojimai and Hyakuman Goku for the Kakemai, both of which are milled to 60%. The sake meter value is plus 10. So again, this is super dry. Oh yeah. Acidity is 1.8, so not a lot going on there. The alcohol percentage is 17, so it's slightly high, but not tremendously. And it's apparently also aged for a year, which I find interesting. The result is this very, very dry, but still kind of bright and exciting sake. The texture is very smooth, which not necessarily something you're going to expect from your 60% super dry Junmai. There's a hit of acidity in the middle there before the dryness really kicks in.
The sake that you have, John, I've actually used that in some of my classes before, teaching about it. And one of the reasons I like the Oze no Yukidoki Karakuchi Junmai, it's a great example to show people what a dry finish is really all about. Like that dry finish is pretty substantial and kind of one of the key components that makes that sake unique is that finish, wouldn't you say?
It is. And for me, I have had sake that finishes drier than this. And oftentimes when I have those, like it's too dry and you get this thing where your tongue is like, at the end. It's very unpleasant, for me at least. But this one, it is presenting so dry and it comes across, it's doing that exact thing that it wants to do on the finish, but it's doing it in a really pleasant and enjoyable way. Like I think this sake like celebrates how dry it is, and it's, I mean, obviously in the name, but it celebrates how dry it is, and it wears it on its sleeve, and like you pointed out, it's almost like a case study in dry sake. It's got a great finish.
Yeah, but it doesn't go overboard, and it's still well integrated and drinkable. Right.
It's it doesn't feel out of place, and it doesn't feel like a stunt. Like we made something really dry. You should try it. Nothing quite like that. I've seen like these like Japanese beer commercials that like celebrate how dry the beer is, like with like 6 exclamation points after the word dry. Like this is very dry, but it's still well balanced and dry.
Yeah, and still premium.
Yeah.
The Ryujin Shuzo is also a very small brewery. There's a handful of brewers making sake there.
And they're consistently fantastic.
Yeah, it's a true microbrewery, Ryujin Shuzo.
And they used to make beer too.
Yeah, they used to.
On top of that.
I think the beer workers were separate from the...
Oh.
So it was a separate team. Yeah. But for making their award-winning sake, really super well-trained staff and just fantastic stuff. I don't know how many brewery workers Kokuryu has over in Fukui, but they make some good stuff too.
All right, Tim. Thank you for taking us on this journey through the very first of our Shubo episodes and our focus on the yeast starter.
Yes. This was a slow journey into the world of the fast yeast starter method known as Sokujo.
Right. And I love how we've done one episode of this and we've already covered 90% of sake that's out there.
If all the series could go like this.
We got 10% left.
10% left. So the upcoming yeast starter methods that we have to cover are Kimoto, Yamahai, and Bodaimoto. So we've got 3 more to go, and we'll dive deep into each of those fermentation starter methods coming up in our series, all about Shubo. Looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'm really kind of curious about the Bodaimoto myself. I don't know a whole lot about it. Hopefully you do, or maybe we need to bring in some assistance on that one. I don't know.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. That is the most rare of all of them. So we'll be looking at that in a few weeks. All right. Well, thanks, John. That was really fun. And I also want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in and listening to our show. We really do hope that you're enjoying Sake Revolution. If you'd like to show your support for our podcast, there's one way you can really help us out. That would be to take a couple of minutes and leave us a written review on Apple Podcasts. It's a great way for us to get the word out about our show.
And when you're done leaving your review over at Apple Podcasts, please go ahead and tell your friends. It's a really direct method. and
family.
Sorry?
And family.
And family, yes. Friends and family. You can get them into sake too. And then get them to subscribe, especially the family members. This way, every week when we put out a new episode, it will show up on your device of choice, and you will not miss a single episode.
And as always, if you'd like to learn more about any of the specific sakes we tasted in today's episode, or anything about the topics that we talked about, please visit our website, sakerevolution.com, and there you can check out all the detailed show notes.
And for all of your sake questions that you need answered, please reach out to us. The email address is feedback@sakerevolution.com. So until next time, please remember to keep drinking sake and
Kanpai!